It is absurd that on this so-called slimmed-down monarchy that Charles and William have been talking about, the costs go up and up. We don't get a slimmed-down cost, we get an expansive cost. The royal family is bloated and needs to go on a diet. And we're seeing the exact opposite with this announcement in the last 24 hours.
Now, the Keeper of the Privy Purse, James Chalmers, insists the funding is not a blank cheque and comes with strict value for money terms. But in the wake of the Andrew Mountbatten Windsor revelations, the announcement will likely lead to further scrutiny of the royal family's finances. Meanwhile, profits at the Crown Estate have slumped over the past year, with the amount of money handed back to the Treasury being cut by more than half as a result. Norman Baker is a former Liberal Democrat minister and author of Royal Mint National Debt and joins me now. Good morning.
Morning, James.
So the sovereign grant formula introduced by George Osborne when you were in government too, I think, is considered by many to be generous, to put it mildly, and has been updated since. Explain how it works and why it's proved controversial in some quarters.
It replaced the civil list, which had been there for 251 years, which meant an amount of money allocated by Parliament and scrutinised by Parliament every so often. The sovereign grant is not subject to consideration by Parliament unless it reduces or, in other words, has to be brought back by the government. It's linked quite illogically to the profits of the public body that's called the Crown Estate. The Crown Estate has been effectively a public body since 1760, is not the King's own property, despite what people may think. And the Crown Estate is a property body that has been doing very well. It's beat inflation generally every year, and it's had a massive windfall in recent times as a consequence of the fact that it owns a seabed and is responsible, therefore, for collecting money for all the wind farms which are going up offshore. That in turn has meant that the 7.9 million civil list in 2011 has become 132.1 million in sovereign grant this year, which includes the element for Buckingham Palace. But as you said correctly in the introduction, or the news bulletin did, the amount of money which has gone up in the coal grant to the royal family has more than doubled in 3 years. This is outrageous, really, in terms of the amount of money which is being spent on the royals, which I estimate now has costed the public purse £500 million a year.
Gosh, OK. And we've had this new adjustment set out before Parliament, this new formula that's been agreed whereby the royal household will receive 20.5% of Crown Estate profits, up from 12%. Meanwhile, interesting that those latest annual figures from the Crown Estate reveal that operating profits fell to £1.2 billion in the year to March, compared with £1.4 billion last year, due to a smaller boost from offshore wind. The pressure group Republic, which campaigns for an elected head of state, has branded royal finances out of control this morning. Is that a fair assessment, Norman, when you consider the return both financially in terms of things like tourism and also politically and diplomatically in terms of its soft power?
Well, first of all, in terms of soft power, Charles, of course, did very well when he went to America and addressed Congress. But you don't need to have a £500 million royal family for him to do that. Most royal families in Europe consist of the head of state, their children and the children's children, and that's what we should be having in this country. And that formula over here would enable soft power to be exercised, but at far less cost. 500 million, as I say, is a cost at the moment over here. The next nearest is the Netherlands, which costs, I think, their state £46 million, a less than a tenth of what ours costs. So, we have to look at that in that route. As far as tourism is concerned, we've now got a situation where we've spent £369 million of public money on Buckingham Palace. And by the way, it used to be required for the King to pay the upkeep of Buckingham Palace. That was transferred to the state instead. So in the previous years, that would have been paid for by the King. That's a huge amount of money. It's refurbished all the bedrooms and so on. And now we find out that Charles and Camilla aren't living there. Well, I don't want to force them to live in Buckingham Palace, but if they're not living there, then we should open the palace 365 days a year, or 364 days a year anyway, and the money that comes in from the ticket sales should be going back to the Treasury to offset the massive cost that's been incurred. But do you know what's happening with the money at the moment? It's regarded by the King as, quote, private money, unquote, and doesn't get returned to Treasury, but kept at Buckingham Palace.
OK. Well, the palace will say All these financial records being released is part of efforts to evolve and modernise, including a slimmed-down monarchy, as you've set out there. Do you think that will stick, or would you argue, Norman, for a complete reset in terms of how the royal family is funded?
We need a complete reset. We need to return to some sort of civil list, which I've called with Andrew Loney, the author. We've called it for a royal duties grant, which is scrutinised by Parliament, and that's how we should be funding the monarchy. It is absurd that on this so-called slimmed-down monarchy that Charles and William have been talking about, the costs go up and up. We don't get a slimmed-down cost; we get an expansive cost. The royal family is bloated and needs to go on a diet, and we're seeing the exact opposite with this announcement in the last 24 hours.
But this comes down to transparency, essentially, doesn't it? And indeed, the King has become the first monarch to publish their tax bill. £12.9 million for the last year, more than £30 million in total since ascending to the throne. Isn't the King in a bit of a catch-22 here? He's responding positively to calls for greater transparency from people like yourself, but in doing so, will get clobbered when people read the numbers.
Well, look, I mean, this is a bit of a palace spin, isn't it? Because when Charles was Prince of Wales, he used to publish his amount of money he paid in tax. That was nothing new. So all he's doing is continuing what he did when he was Prince of Wales. However, he stopped when he became king, not because I think he wanted to, but because William objected to carrying on Charles' tradition of publishing the tax paid as a Duke of Cornwall, as Prince of Wales, heir to the throne. Now, Williams had to go into an embarrassing U-turn and start declaring that again. So we're just going back to where we were really before before Charles ascended the throne. So we haven't got much transparency. We don't know how it's broken down. There's nothing apart from this overall figure. We don't know how much is coming from dividend investments or from the Duchy of Lancaster or from his own private dwellings, where he's now mercilessly commercialising those and having wedding parties and so on to raise money for himself. We don't know what the division is. We don't know what's being put down in terms of expenses, because we do know from the 2005 Public Accounts Committee report that back at that time, Charles, as Prince of Wales, was claiming for stabling for Camilla's horses, claiming for her dresses, before they were even married, against the Duchy of Cornwall's accounts, and even tried to claim as polo ponies. So, this is one small step. But to be honest with you, it's a 1,000-mile journey. We haven't gone very far, have we?
OK, well, one small step. I wonder if it's a natural progression towards greater accountability and transparency, values we increasingly demand and expect from public bodies in the 21st century. Or do you think it takes a crisis like the Andrew scandal and subsequent financial revelations to force the monarchy to change and adapt?
I think they will always try to respond to crises which occur, but they'll respond with the minimum amount of effort or the minimum amount of movement to try and kill the public disquiet at any particular time. They always run behind public opinion, and they always do the minimum possible to try and get away with it. That's the truth of the matter. And in terms of transparency, you're absolutely right that people do demand transparency from public bodies and public money. And the royal family, the monarchy, is a public body receiving public money to undertake public duties. And therefore, they should be subject to the same constraints and accountability as members of Parliament, as the House of Lords, as local councils, as the money spent on the health service or in our schools. There should be no different to that. But what they have done over the last 15 years in particular is by and large exempt themselves from the Freedom of Information Act. Although I was given an assurance as a member of Parliament in 2001, as the Act came into force, that the monarchy would be treated the same as any other public body. Well, that's now been eroded, and there's now an absolute blanket exemption on Charles and William. You can find nothing out at all, even if it's in the public interest to do so.